Our show wouldn't exist without you listening. But if you want more information on how to become a guest, how to recommend a guest, or just to stay in touch, go to flippingthelid.com. We'll see you there.
You know what we do here by now. We flip the lid inside the stories of some of the most significant and successful people that have walked this planet. People who are creating impact, people who flip the lids in their own lives and businesses. And today's story is no different. We were introduced by a mutual friend of ours, a really phenomenal host, podcast, and coach, Juliette Hahn, who immediately said, you have to talk to this woman. And as I got to dig into her story, it became very obvious the trials and tribulations that she faced early in life, some paths that could have put her in prison or ended in death, but yet she found a way to get herself onto the right track. And in fact, ended up reaching some of the highest academic accolades by getting a master's from MIT and moving through the world in the tech space to really create impact, but ultimately realized that it wasn't aligned at her deepest level. She had to flip her lid, look inside, scan her can, and redirected her life that's now really geared towards impact. And so, Rimi, I could not be more excited to have you here today. The little bit I know about you, I'm looking forward to jumping in.
Wow, thank you, Brian. What a pleasure and honor to be here.
Well, I at a very high level just hit on who I believe you to be, but I always like to ask our guests, who are you in your words?
Well, I'm here to serve. That's really how I explain what I'm here to do. I've realized that I accomplished everything and anything I set out to do, which I realize is a huge accomplishment in itself. And I'm really grateful for that. And once I realized that I could do anything, I asked myself, well, what is my highest and best use? And who decides that? And so I'm here to serve. And I call myself a mindful leader, working with leaders to help them find their missions.
Beautiful. What does serving mean to you? And what is the integration of serving yourself versus serving others?
Yeah. So serving to me means using my unique talents and gifts, like what I'm competent in, what I'm talented in, and combining that with what I love to do, with what lights me up, what I do when I lose time or time stops. And those two things combined with what does the world need? What does the world actually need? Does it need more algorithms or more infinite scrolls or more apps to take our attention away from ourselves? No, I think not. And so serving for me is the intersection of my talents and skills, what I love, what the world needs, and doing it in a way that I'm not attached to the outcomes.
Yeah.
And that's the big piece. And that's really hard to do, by the way, when you're an entrepreneur and when you make a living based on what you do. So there's that constant ego check bringing me back to that. And then what does it mean to serve others? I would say it's helping them to discover their light. Like I think of lighthouses and I think of if we can shine our light, if we can light up, meaning if we can honor our gifts, if we can share what we're really good at without worrying that we're bragging or being boastful, and if we can do it without being attached to outcome, then we can light up the way for these other lighthouses. And these other lighthouses light the way for all of us that are searching, and we're all searching.
Yeah. We are, I think to have the perspective on light versus dark, it means you also understand dark, right? One particle of light can overtake over 1 million particles of darkness. Yet so many people exist in a place where the darkness is all they see, all they feel. And that's why it's important for so many others who are leaders in a position to be able to do so, to be those lighthouses, to shine those lights, to highlight the paths for others. Take us back to some of the dark times in your life that started to give you this perspective that there was a better way, that you didn't have to remain on that same path.
Yeah, I guess there are a number of dark patches in a good way. And like I say that because I've flipped my lid, so to speak, several times. But The first one that comes to mind is really feeling purposeless in my old corporate life, if you will, when I was working in management consulting and I was on my way to making a partner. I was burning both ends of the candle, so to speak, really bringing in the deals, winning all the accolades you could think of, being successful on paper and by anyone's account, but feeling completely purposeless. And specifically, I remember there was a meeting with a client that we were working with, and I had presented the solutions or the scenarios for a relocation strategy. It's like what I did back in my old career. And in that meeting, we had addressed the client's concern of, oh, we care about our people, we care about our teams, we care about all these things, culture, et cetera. And once we presented the solutions, apparently something they had never shared with us, even in the many interviews we did with them, that they just wanted a 2-year ROI for a headquarters move, which is near impossible if you know anything about that space. Mm-hmm. And it felt like, gosh, this myopic lens of profit is being used to make massive decisions that affect so many people's lives. I felt completely like I was banging my head against a wall, and my health in the meantime, I had developed these chronic urinary tract infections that led to a couple of surgeries and even pre-cancer. I had no idea at the time that that was directly connected to my just putting everyone else and everything else before myself and just working really hard. And it wasn't until I realized that, gosh, this doesn't really matter. Am I sacrificing myself for this just to make this huge, profitable public company even more profitable? Is that it?
I resonate deeply with so much of your story because it sounds very similar to the pattern of mine, right? I mean, and so many high performers who followed the path that the world outlined that defined external success based on whatever, right? Often monetary, often in the corporate space, but it has, I believe, over these last 15 to 20 years, really put profit over people.
Yeah.
And I have this really core fundamental belief that it's who before what and people before profits. And if we can center that, that's what becomes real. As you're in the midst of the rise, you're starting to grow in your success, you're having these accolades, which, by the way, is also what you were seeking in a lot of that period of your life, right? What was the turning point? What was the light that got shined on the path that was possible for you? Because I can hear where you're stuck and what you're experiencing, but that doesn't mean that you see a way out. Where was the light? Where did it come from? And what moment did it hit you?
Yeah, well, there was one particular day where we went out as a team. It was a summer outing on Boston Harbor, beautiful day, and we were celebrating the team's success. It was our annual summer outing, and we had a small company at the time. I think we were about 15, so it was a nice intimate group. Mostly men. I was the only woman that wasn't like an office manager. And so we had a small group. We, of course, drank a lot of sun, lots of lobster rolls and you name it, really good food. And that continued into happy hour at the seaport. And then we ended up at a colleague's house and, we got into all sorts of things. We kept drinking. I think people were smoking some joints. Of course, it was too much sun and too much drinking. I'm like a 2-drink wonder. So I was well and over my head. And something that maybe we'll get into later that I had learned many lessons from that was no longer my path, but I'd just fallen into it because it was so easy to get swept up into that. And at some point, I don't even know what time it was, a colleague of mine was holding my hair as I was, vomiting into a sink of all places, because I don't know why I wasn't in the bathroom. But it was, looking back, it was kind of hilarious because it brought the team, we all had stories like this. This was part of the fun of the team I worked with. They were a really cool group. But I hadn't told my husband where I was. And I remember waking up, I don't know what time it was, in my colleague's guest bed and realizing, oh my gosh, he must be worried sick about me. I didn't tell him where I was. Last time I had checked in with him was, at noon that day. It's like 3 a.m. And here I was putting a relationship at risk, getting into, there's fun and then there's too much fun. And a lot of why I started to lose respect for some of my, the way that I worked was because some of that way of fun led to things that people regretted after, like extramarital shenanigans or just, getting drunk as an escape or smoking weed as an escape rather than, oh, hey, it's a once in a while thing that brings a team together. And I remember when I spoke with my husband, and he is a saint that he forgave me, of course, and understood, but it led to this deeper question of, because I had, in the meantime, had also been telling him how frustrated I was that this purposeless job, like I spoke about, and he and I just spoke deeply about what was important to us and what we really wanted to do with our lives. And that led to the next journey.
That place where you feel like you've maybe let your partner down, you've had some disappointment, you realize that whatever decisions were made leading up to that moment, right, happened. You can't change them. You can't anything. You know, your husband clearly had a lot of grace, but what were you feeling in that moment of realization in how your husband could have felt?
Well, I was feeling mostly disappointed with myself because I had a history with drug abuse long ago, like as a teenager, like it's like a 13-year-old. And in many ways, I mean, that had been so far behind me. I mean, that ended, that was really just a year or two, maybe a little dabble in high school here and there, but it never progressed. And I felt in that moment that, oh my gosh, I'd gone back to that place that I vowed to never go back to.
Hey.
And I imagine that he felt scared and worried because I'm sure he had no idea like what could have happened. I mean, he had called me, I had several missed calls from him, text messages, etc. And I just was so grateful that he understood and that he didn't give me the hard time that some partners maybe would have given. I mean, it was the first and only time that kind of thing ever happened. So that was a good thing. But it was definitely a wake-up call.
Well, and what you just hit on is something that we work really, really deep with, right? We help people identify and remove the trash from their past that continues to show up as their biggest problems, the repeat patterns, those things that are their fatal flaws, right? And you know, the resonance of that moment, as much as it was connected to your current husband, also had a much deeper resonance and disappointment of self because of a repeat pattern that was tied to some trash from your past.
Yeah.
And so the acknowledgement and awareness for you to be able to communicate about it like that is very, very clear because you were also able to separate what you were reacting to in the moment versus what it actually did to impact your spouse, which you were now going to try to create repair. Take us back though, because you said, I didn't think I'd ever go back to that place, right?
Yeah.
And you've alluded to it a couple of times, and I knew we were going to come back full circle to the earlier parts of your story. But, you know, you talk about being addicted to drugs at age 13. Bring us back before that. Give us some early childhood stuff. What led to that place in the beginning?
Yeah. So I'm a Southern girl. I was born in Alabama, of all places. My parents had an arranged marriage and met on their wedding day. And my dad was placed in Alabama as a professor. And so that's how we were living there for the first 8 years of my life. And he got moved to the University of Pennsylvania. And so we moved to Philadelphia, our whole family. And those first 8 years were awesome. I remember people made fun of me because they were like, what are you? Are you white? Are you black? I mean, there was that whole conversation that was, you know, as a young kid, it was mostly, it was pretty trivial and playful. It wasn't a big deal. When I went to Philadelphia, my parents—
Can I pause you there real quick though?
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people almost look at it that way, like it's trivial. But there are many people I know who are mixed race and are in different positions where even the question of like, what are you or who are you or what box do you fit into creates patterns of belief that we act like, I don't know, it's trivial back then, but it is really tied to elements of identity. So I don't want to take your story away or to minimize the fact that it was there, but I hear you say it was kind of trivial, but it felt deeper than that.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I guess it was the things that kids do, but it was bigger. I remember we lived in a cul-de-sac and we had some African-American neighbors that moved next door, and a Caucasian older brother of a friend of mine said, "Hey, I'll give you a candy bar if you stand outside this house and yell the word Nigger." And I remember doing that as a 6-year-old, and I had no idea. And that family, oh my God, it like makes me sad just to think about it. I had no idea what I was saying. I just wanted a candy bar. Yeah. You know, and that candy bar was, gosh, it was, you know, representative of all the crap that gets, the dangling carrots that get put over us to do horrible things. But, you know, it was that kind of stuff that happened that I didn't really understand, and it didn't really bother me per se because I didn't have the framework to process it. I was just, it was just, you know, as being a kid, we were being a kid. And at the same time, we had African-American friends. We didn't even relate that they were the same, you know, it was just all a game. And and so then I would say when I moved to Philadelphia, that's where I experienced more of that discrimination. I think mostly because I was a little bit older. I went to middle school there, and my parents bought a house that ended up being a total lemon. And speaking of discrimination, you know, my dad tells me, and my mom agrees, that he was completely taken advantage of in the sales process. And apparently the adjuster, the appraiser was in on it. And they have this long story about how they changed things. Whatever happened, it was a lemon, and it led to some major difficulties in my parents' marriage. That's when things started to fall apart for them. And I ended up moving in with my mom.
How old were you at this time?
I was 9. I was 9.
Okay.
I was 9 when my parents split. Yeah.
Okay.
And so my mom is an amazing woman, and I'm so grateful for her for all the choices that she made. But she was always raised as someone's wife or someone's daughter or someone's sister. And that's how most women in India were raised of her generation. And so for the first time, she was by herself alone, and she unfortunately fell into alcoholism, which I think might have started a little bit earlier than when we actually ended up, when they split. But it was something that I was then kind of pushed into living with. And she didn't have the resources to process what was incredibly traumatic for her.
Right.
And my father was just out of the picture for a while. I think they were fighting, and, he didn't want to be involved. And I was like, I'm an only child. And so I ended up being, I think, maybe a pawn in this whole mess. And a few years went by, and I got into, 6th grade and then 7th grade, where I was always excelling in school. I mean, I would always get straight A's. That was my thing. It was something that I was gifted in, and I was in the gifted program. But then suddenly my mom was working night shift. And so when I would come home from school, I didn't have any parent at home. And I quickly gained popularity by having the cool kids over to my house after school. And of course we would smoke dope, and we made prank calls. Like, this was the 90s. I mean, we were, all sorts of things, but it got deeper and deeper and worse and worse. And I think we pushed the envelope more and more. And I have to pause for a second to just say that most of what happened at this time was a blur until just about a year or two ago, when I actually was given the opportunity. I did this self-inquiry sabbatical, and all of this came flooding back. And I've done a lot of work and processing to be able to talk about this, because it was just, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie 13.
Yeah.
So that was like, when I watched that movie, it was like, oh my God, that was my life. Like, so we got into harder things. We did like PCP. We even smoked crack. And I was in 7th grade. I was 12. I don't even know how we got our hands on that stuff. And it was just a really bad time. And I think all the kids that I was hanging out with were also in a really bad place. We all came from broken homes, and a lot of alcoholism in the families of these kids. And we would just do horrible things. We would break storefront windows. And I just, and by the way, I was still getting straight A's at school, but I was coming to school high every single day. And there was a real disconnect from what was going on in the outer world and what was going on in my inner world.
Oh yeah.
So, yeah. And so I remember, I finally, looking back, I realized I was looking for attention. I wouldn't have said it that way then.
Yeah. I mean, you were seeking validation, connection, and love through performance, and you didn't even know it. It was unconscious, but you were getting accolades and recognition for the good grades in class by teachers, being in the gifted program. It's probably something that both of your parents in some form or fashion gave you accommodation and credit or recognition for, that might not have existed in other areas of your life. Like, by the way, most of us high performers have learned how to receive love, validation, and connection through performance in some form or fashion, right? Codependent relationships through alcoholism and shame and the byproduct of all that. No doubt, my friend.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's like the fawn response. There's the fight, flight, or freeze, but then now there's also fawn.
There's fawn, yeah.
People pleasing. And I got really good at people pleasing because, I never knew what I was going to come home to. So, like I said, my mom worked night shift, but then on the weekends, I would come home, or I would be out or come home from being out. And I didn't know if I would find her, drunk on the floor, passed out. I would have to put her to bed. We jokingly, even to this day, she calls me mom.
Yeah.
And for most of my adolescence, I took care of her, and I took care of us. But that led to my success for sure, because that led to me knowing exactly, okay, where's the A, where's the top, boom, I'm there. And I could always reach it. And it only was recently that I realized, this is actually a trauma response, and it's a double-edged sword, because people pleasing has its major downsides.
Bingo.
As high performers know.
Well, I mean, here's the reality, like as high performers too, most of us carry a lot of armor, but don't have effective boundaries. Right. And so what does that mean? It means emotional extortion in some cases. It means saying yes in so many ways, because that's where we get the connection, even if it's something we can't do, don't have the capacity for. Right. And when we're ones that carry so much weight and give in so many cases, it ends up being many relationships where people want something from you instead of for you. And we allow it, right? We allow it because that's the type of belief system we have based on the love that we think we deserve, based on those early patterns that exist for us, which was no different for you. What I'm really fascinated in, Rimi, is you talk about it now with clarity, with the ability to say, hey, it was only 18 to 24 months ago that I saw all of this, that I was really understanding this, that I was starting to process this. Yeah. As you talk about it now, there's moments of emotion, but it's also very transactional, almost in the way the words come out. And I know that for myself in telling my story, right, it's like the story can just kind of own itself and we don't put ourselves in it.
Yeah.
I want to challenge you to go in that story for a few minutes, because I want you to talk about that 9 to 13 period of time. And I want you to put yourself in your body. What were you feeling at that time? What were the intellectual and the emotional narratives that rooted your belief system in that period of your life?
That's a great question, first of all, and great insight. So I can feel when I put myself back there that it's really tense in my heart space. It's really tight. And I remember in that time that I just wanted to fix it. That I remember witnessing my parents having an enormous fight, and it was, somewhat violent. My parents, it was never violent, like domestic abuse, but it was a lot of yelling and throwing. It was, it was intense. And I just remember writing my mom a note that said, "I'm sorry, please forgive me," from my dad. I signed it from dad. And I wrote my dad a note, the same thing. "I'm sorry, please forgive me," from mom. And they saved it. And actually, it's funny, I didn't really remember the memory, but they saved the notes, and the combination of them telling me about it, seeing the notes, and then the work I did last year, like, I can remember that. I can remember being on the top of the stairs and watching them fight through the banisters of the stair and just wanting to fix it, because I think any kid thinks everything is their fault, because, our ego is forming and everything is about us. And that's the way that's the way our brains work. That's the way humans work. And I just thought it was my fault. I thought if I could help them, if I could make it better. And it's funny because that led to me today being a guide for leaders and being a healer and doing this work. And also it was a major issue as I grew up, because I took on everyone as my charity case for a long time. For a long time in my life, I would be the confidant of my friends, and the friendship was basically them telling me their problems.
Oh, yeah.
And talk about boundaries. It took me a long time to realize that, like, wait a minute, every time we hang out, they always talk about their lives and their problems.
And they don't ask you any questions.
About mine, it's like time to go. It took me a long time to realize that.
By the way, me too. Yeah, it's a pattern. I get it. Keep going, though. I love where you're going with this.
Yeah. And then it's funny. I also remember I was always really athletic, and I do think it was the sports stuff that in the end kind of brought me out. But when I was in that space, I remember being allowed out until whatever time. I think it was 10 o'clock was my curfew. And even though I would go out and do these crazy things and these horrible things that most parents would be like horrified knowing that they're, I think then I was maybe 13-year-old was doing, I still sprinted home to get home by 10 o'clock all the time. It was just like, I was never late. Not even a minute. And I don't even know where that came from, but I think it must be the same place that I always got those straight A's. I had to get the straight A.
Yeah.
And even though I actually, when I was in 8th grade, I was on the track team, but then I quit the track team so that I could hang out with the cool kids and smoke a joint on the way home from school. And, track was usually after school. So it was like one or the other. So I gave up track so that I could smoke a joint and hang out with the cool kids. And, then I remember one day when I was leaving that school system, because so there was one particular day, which is still fuzzy because it was so intense, but I basically attempted suicide, and it was really like, whatever. I clearly didn't really want to do it because I guess then it would have happened, but I got my parents' attention, and they had called the police, and they had put me into I went to this, I think it was like a psych ward, which was like the worst way to handle at the time. I'm hoping it's changed from then, but it was the scariest response to a call for help because it just felt like I was in trouble. And I ended up, my parents finally got together. They finally communicated. All cards were on the table because up until that point, I had told my mom certain things, I had told my dad certain things, but they never spoke. So there was no real truth. And then they decided to put me into this really amazing private school and move in with my dad and my stepmom, because my dad had then found his now wife. And I remember being out with the so-called friends that I spent all my time with, that I quit the track team for. And one of them tipped me off and said, Rimi, run right now. They're all about to jump you. And I was like, what? And then I see them coming at me with like this, the energy that I felt was just like, oh my God. And so I ran. I just ran and ran and ran and ran. And I remember hiding in a bush and being scared that my breath would give me away, because I was holding my breath, but I thought my heart was beating outside of me. And they were right there in front of me, like wondering where I had gone. And it was one of the scariest nights of my life. And luckily I got away. And then my real friends, it's funny because some of those people weren't all, conscious, like lack of conscious. Some of those people actually had good hearts. They then met me at my home and were like, oh my gosh, you're okay. And it was fine. But it was just, I guess, a great way to end that crazy time.
You embedded a whole lot into that story and that whole portion of the narrative. And so thank you for your willingness to continue to dive deeper and continue to become more vulnerable and to share elements of your story. As I listen to your story, it resonates so deeply, I'm sure, with so many kids who grew up with split parents who fought and argued, alcoholism in the family, in the house, and that desire to be seen and understood, but also to just fix it all is so important. Yeah. I mean, I know we have a 7 and a 9-year-old, and I'll tell you that, like, I used to deal with anger, right? And we used to actually, my wife and I used to actually fight in the house in front of our children in ways that I'm not proud of, but it was historical. And a lot of work has been done and a lot of that has been moved. But what's funny is, even if we get into a place at this point where it's even a simple disagreement, right? Or we have clear, firm, confident communication from a varying point, our kids are like, whoa, you guys can't be fighting. You guys can't be fighting, right? Like I think that's such a natural reaction. And to your point, the concept of children often putting blame, it's unfortunate that there are not more adults who will verbalize and remove that burden that's placed on our kids. Right. Our parents in our generation, I don't think had the words, didn't have the ability, didn't have, the observational awareness to be able to start to grow there. But so many of us are now starting to break generational patterns for this next generation. So when did you start to realize that your voice had power in being able to give people permission to go places and to do things that were required for them to move?
Well, that's a great question. So I would say, well, we have to fast forward a few major life transitions. Like after I moved to the Azores, that was a big thing. And then it was in the pandemic then that I started doing online work and taking the lessons that I learned in running our business here in the Azores to my old clients who had broken my soul in a sense of that profit-driven, that metric only being profit. And so I took my lessons of leadership to them and started sharing what I'd learned. And when I was pitching them, the words just came, and I was getting hired during the pandemic by these clients that literally saved our business. We were able to keep our staff on full time. But more than that, they would say things to me like, okay, this was December 2020. Oh, we used to take our company out on a company offsite. Oh, I know what those are, right? But this year we need to do something different because we're all online. Can you design something for us? And boom, I remember the curriculum came to me like a download. I didn't even need to go research anything.
So magical.
It was just,
I totally know that feeling.
It was just, we're going to start with values, and then we're going to break out, and then we're going to look at this, and we're going to talk about metrics of success and what do they really mean, and then boom, we're going to do some movement. And it was phenomenal. And I was so nervous, of course, because it was the first time I had done anything like that. And it was a big client. It was a Fortune 100 company that I was doing this with. So I felt like, wow, the stakes are high. And people really resonated. They really connected. It seemed to me like it was the first time they had looked within themselves in that way. And I was really bridging the like corporate lingo with the yoga and the spiritual world and making it very accessible. And they got it. And that's when I thought, this is meaningful. And I thought, okay, great, that's one and done. And the next thing I know, they asked me, oh, we want to continue with you on a monthly basis. And so that work continued for a few years and then led to a whole bunch of other things. And where I am now, where I'm doing a lot more one-on-one work with leaders, people who are really committed to making a difference in the world. You know, like I said, I'm here to serve, right? A lot of people, that might not be everyone's focus. And I understand that, but they might be here to solve real problems. They might be here to pave the way in a new way of working or a new way of thinking. And my ability to go into my own dark places and the work that I did excavating and understanding and integrating, because it's not just going in one and done. I mean, it's definitely a process and there's layers to it. But when I shared my vulnerable moments in these one-on-ones, and I would tell a story or I would share an example, it immediately opened them up to be vulnerable in a way that maybe they hadn't been with themselves before.
Yeah.
And I realized that my voice had power in as much as I was staying authentic to my truth. That's where the power came from.
You know, my purpose in life is to allow my truth to give others permission to live theirs. And I believe so deeply that so many things that root to suffering often have to do with the things that are left unsaid, the things that we lack permission to feel or say, the things we lack the words to articulate or understand, the things that are left undone. And I'm a believer that every time I share my truth, just like you just expressed so eloquently, right, you're giving people permission to feel and say things they might not have otherwise, and words to articulate and understand their unique perspective that maybe they're still unconscious to, but by hearing it through transference, they have transformation. And it's a really beautiful way that you articulated that. I also really appreciated the nuance of the integration between the corporate and yogic speak to be able to make it accessible. When did you learn the importance of making sure that your language was accessible to different audiences?
Gosh, I think it was so yoga's always been a passion of mine and not just an exercise. I mean, it started that way, as I think it does for a lot of people, but I started when I was 16. Actually, it was my father that introduced me to yoga back when I was 16. But when I spoke about doing yoga, I remember being with this venture capital crowd, which were where we networked, because a lot of the deals that they funded would need real estate solutions, and that's where we would get clients from. And they were mostly men, mostly white. And I remember talking about I remember talking about yoga and just sharing something about myself. And one of the guys I was speaking to was like, oh, that's hot. Can you do a pose for us? And I was like, oh, seriously? I just felt so demeaning.
Like a dagger to the heart, because you're like, no, there's deeper, like it's deeper than just looking at my body. Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, even if you're doing yoga just for physical, I mean, you're kind of getting the spiritual benefits, whether you know it or not.
You are. By the way, I've practiced yoga quite a bit myself. It's absolute integration.
Yeah. And I wouldn't say that it consciously made me think about how to say it differently. I think the words just came naturally. So communication is one of my gifts. I talked about uniting my gifts with what I love to do and with what the world needs. One of my gifts is communication. And, being able to say things, especially complex things, or sometimes simple things that can be complex, in a way that people can understand, is always been something that I've just been drawn to. It's just a natural kind of expression of who I am. And so I think it started more officially, I would say, in the last year or so, and really now I'm writing about it. I'm sharing articles. My book that's coming out is all about this. And it's how do we get past the feeling of separation and the triggering words? Because sometimes people hear the word spirit or woo-woo or God or whatever, and they shut down. They just close off. And even the word purpose is apparently a trigger word. And I don't want to disrespect anyone that is a trigger for, but it's like, can we sit with what makes us uncomfortable so that we can actually hear and explore and listen?
Well, I've witnessed you do that multiple times throughout our conversation. You pause, you take a breath, you center yourself, and then you allow the wisdom to flow through you. You know, it's a really beautiful level of surrender that I watch from you. And I think that your gift of communication, though you say it is one of your natural gifts, which I believe and accept completely, you've also put a lot of intention into honing the ability to communicate, given the limited access of number of words we have in our language and your ability to allow them to be structured in a way that's accessible for many. Again, I don't think that that's a coincidence based on your path. I think it was a mode of survival as much as it was conditioning your natural gift, because that's how you learn to blend into all these different environments. That's how you were able to access and reach high levels of success as a gang member, as a drug addict, as a professional, it doesn't really matter what level you're at. That requires communication to facilitate connection. And so I want to reflect that back to you, just to honor it's obvious the intent that you have in just surrendering to allow the download to come through. It's a completely different piece than accessing knowledge to try to articulate it intentionally. And that's a really cool divide to witness in you. You know, in retrospect, was your drive to succeed more difficult on you or on those that were around you?
Oh, I think definitely on those that were around me. I'm thinking of my husband now for sure.
Yeah.
I think I drove him nuts when we first moved here to the Azores, and we actually went through, there was a patch where I wasn't sure we were going to get through. And it was because I was so focused on that, on those external metrics, on, it's got to be like this. And I can't accept this failure. It's not okay. And so it was more, I would say it was more on the people around me, because I had been through worse. I mean, when I look at my life, it was worse way, way back. And so the trials and tribulations that have happened since then have been, while they're hard and I don't want to like poo-poo them, so to speak, it helps to put things in perspective. And so definitely more recently, it's been the people that I'm around.
Appreciate your honesty in that. The removal of expectations and the separation from outcomes is such a difficult thing. No matter how much intent we put into it, I think we are so hardwired and conditioned sometimes to exist beyond this present moment in a future that we can't necessarily control or influence. And I'm curious, you talk about this never-ending cycle of trying to remove those outcomes, remove those expectations. Where are you still struggling to remove expectations or the measurement of outcomes in your life?
Now, okay, so that's a great question. So for example, in the past, because I mentioned I'd started this new business, which was working with companies online on leadership consulting and one-on-one executive coaching, of course, there's got to grow the client base, and what's your revenue goal? What are your SMART goals? Are they specific and measurable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And so I started to do that. And I noticed again that everything that I wrote down, I did. And again, I wasn't setting unrealistic goals. I wasn't being ridiculous. I was setting goals based on actual possibilities, and then I would reach them. And so when I started to realize, like I said earlier, that, okay, who am I to decide the goals? Let me just be guided. Because I've always been really good at that discipline, that structure, that masculine energy, if you will. It's not necessarily male or female. It's just that kind of masculine aspect. I knew I needed to, and since I moved here, I had been cultivating my more feminine, or the more surrender, flow, trust, let it go kind of aspect. And what that has meant to me recently is I literally got out a piece of paper and I made a big circle. And in this circle, I wrote out everything that, it's on the perimeter of the circle. So it's the structure of the circle. I wrote around it all the things that support me to be at my best. So that, for example, is my daily meditation practice. There's not a day that goes by that I miss that. And I structure my life around it. It's amazing and it keeps me grounded. There's my 3 to 4 times a week of movement practice that I need to stay grounded. There's my 1 to 2 times a year of travel that I need to get off the island in order to remember how much I love it. And all the other things. And so I put all the things that make the structure of this container, if you will, around the circle. And then in the center, I just wrote, serve for the highest good. And I made that very intentional. I've since come to work with the full moon and the new moon. I do a lot of ceremonies and intention setting and release that into, the collective. And amazingly, I became very aware. The signs were obvious when I started to pay attention as to where I should be putting my focus, how to discern who should I say yes to, who should I maybe find a way to push off a little bit, or maybe even say outright no to, and being guided towards goals rather than setting them for myself has been a game changer. Now, I will say for 90% of my clients, they're not like that. Like 90% of my clients, I'm working with them on SMART goals, on just having a goal in the first place. And it's usually that aspect that's missing. But in my case, because I came from this world of, as I shared, this background of having to have structure to survive, I needed to soften. And so that softening was
so beautiful,
has been really key.
So beautiful. Yeah, again, I resonate so deeply. I mean, I operated under such a high level of control to be able to make sure that everything was right, that I was dialed on time, my calendar was totally tight, like everything, right? Everything had purpose and intention. But it was because I also always attached to those goals. And I actually really appreciate how you're able to talk about that, because the reality of it is so many people don't have anything they're focused on, right?
Yeah.
And then there's others of us who have things that we're focused on and we go 10 times too far in that one direction potentially, because we're going to make sure that it happens and we're going to control and we're going to get there. I found so much grace in the silent times as well, right? Meditation, going inward, but it took me a long time to get there. And I find that there's still a lot of people that even I coach and guide through breathwork sessions and help with these things that still believe that meditation is difficult. First of all, what I want to say is meditation has multiple different definitions. It can happen in multiple different ways. It's not always sitting down, your legs crossed, and it is what it is. But that is one very effective way to sit and meditate. But why do you believe that meditation is so difficult for so many people? And given what you do and how you do it, what's one simple rule that you could give people to be successful at meditation for themselves?
Well, I love the way you explain meditation. I wholeheartedly agree. It doesn't have to be sitting and, whatever. Downtime is what I would say we're missing. Our society is missing downtime. We are inundated with overstimulation, and our nervous systems are the same nervous systems of our ancestors some hundreds, even thousands of years ago. And we have never had this level of inundation, and literally our brains can no longer process the amount of stuff coming in. And we are seeing it. I mean, we are seeing it with the guests that we receive here. There's a marked difference in people, especially since the pandemic, in people's ability to retain information and just follow simple directions. Like, what's the gate key code to get into the property? Like, even though it's emailed to you, a video sent to you with a video on how to get in, it's like somehow people aren't getting it. Yeah. And when I find myself getting frustrated, I have to remember, okay, compassion and understanding where this is coming from. But so many of the people I work with, I'm prescribing them downtime. And the biggest question is, what do I do? Yeah. What do I do? Rimi, how do I? And so giving people some parameters on downtime. So one of the practices I incorporate, which has been a life changer for me, I realized that I was getting into too much when I was in this life. I quickly got back into the patterns of maximizing everything. And, I guess I have the Midas touch. The things that I worked on all became big, and I was overwhelmed and getting into burnout again. And I remember my colleague, this guy that works for us, he said, boss, I think you recreated the life that you left behind. And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is not okay. And so I started these once a week silent mornings, and it's like my mindful Monday. So it's between Monday and Friday, depending on what's going on in my week. But I take one morning a week where I don't have any meetings. I don't have any phone calls. I don't look at my phone. I don't look at tech, and I don't have a plan. And I have some rules around, okay, I'm not allowed to exercise because that's usually like, oh, I can catch up on my exercise. Okay, I'm not allowed to read. It's like, no, I'm not catching up on a book that I wanted to read. And I do allow myself to journal, which has been so much of my creative inspiration actually has come through these sessions. And it's only 4 or so hours. And, it's once a week for me because my voice is literally the tool that I use the most often. And so you've got to rest and sharpen your tools. You can't just burn them out and use them forever without any maintenance. Mm-hmm. And I prescribe to people some version of that. So maybe it's like, hey, this weekend, most people are listening to a podcast while they go for a run, or they're walking the dog while they listen to something. It's like, can you just do one thing at a time? Because multitasking has been proven to make us dumber. We can't task switch like that. It's not effective.
Yeah. I definitely recreated my life when I left my old life. And it took me a couple of years to realize it. I find so many people who make that jump for the first time find themselves repeating those same patterns at least once before they escape that. And so good for you for recognizing that pattern and continuing to be intentional with creating that space around it. If we believe quotes attributed to Buddha, like happiness is a journey, not a destination, right? Explain your definition of root silence and how is it obtained?
Yeah, root zillions. Yeah, so it's
root
like
zillions.
Yeah,
zillions.
Yeah.
I read it wrong. Darn it.
It's okay.
I thought I had the word right.
It's a hard word.
I wanted to know that word, and so I had to intentionally integrate it. But man, thanks for catching me. Root zillions.
So the whole concept of resilience is that we are stretched to our limits or even beyond our limits, and that we can bounce back. And that happiness is the journey, and we can, it's okay. We just, we can do it. You got this. Get back in there. And there's this kind of philosophy and this mantra, if you will, of just keep going, which is great and positive, and it's helped a lot of people, sure. But we have been stretched too long and too far, and we don't even know what to come back to because we weren't centered in the first place. And root resilience is about connecting down and in to ourselves and recognizing the first signs of imbalance before we get a disease or disease in the system. Uh-huh. And then happiness is the journey because it's constantly like a pendulum swinging. It's always you're happy. Well, first of all, happiness ideally is something that does not depend on anything external. And it really is our base state. But sometimes we find ourselves, oh, I'm happy because I just did a great job on this podcast, or I'm happy because I just got awarded this new client. But then, oh, now I'm unhappy because I didn't get that client, or I didn't get that job, or I didn't do a good job. And we move away from center throughout our lives. And that's natural. That's human. I think that's the journey that we all signed up for. But how do we go back to center? How do we recognize those signs? That is root resilience. And that's the basis of the book coming out.
I love it. And it's coming out this October of 2023. So how long has the book been in the works? I mean, obviously your life has been a work in progress, and I'm sure a lot of that is integrated, but how long have you actually been actively working on the book, and what are you most excited about the launch?
Well, the book is a co-creation with an amazing colleague and mentor and friend, Samantha Anderson.
Beautiful.
She actually came to Mina Vida, our Lodge and Learning Center, as a guest back in 2019. And we hit it off. She's a functional medicine health coach, and we were originally planning a retreat together for April of 2020. And of course, that didn't happen. And what did happen, she was in New York City at the time. I was here. We had these weekly retreat planning calls where it was probably the only thing on my calendar that I had that I would actually remember to brush my teeth for at the time. I mean, April of 2020 was right after everything shut down.
Oh, yeah.
And we connected and we talked about, gosh, we're holding space for everyone else. Like, we just can't do this. Like, we're being told to be resilient. We're being told to hold it together. We're really being told to hunker down and, to the bang, everything's okay. That's here in the Azores. It was like, everything's fine. Everything's good. To the bang, And she said, gosh, I'm tired of being told to be resilient. We need to be root resilient. And so it started as an online course where we both went to the chakra system. And my name, Rimi Chakraborty, has the chakra in its root of my
That
age.
wasn't lost on me, by the way. I loved that. Yeah.
And Samantha has studied the chakras through foods and herbs, and me through, obviously, through the yoga system, mind-body integration. And both of us had been doing leadership work. She'd worked with the social sector and nonprofits, and I'd been working with more corporates. And so we decided to go from the top down. Most frameworks that are based on the chakras go from the bottom up, the root to the crown. But we both felt intuitively that we don't need to go up and out, more, bigger, taller, higher, more. We need to go down and in. We've lost a connection with ourselves. We've lost a connection with who we are. And so the chakra system, you don't have to believe in them. You don't have to know about them, but it's an amazing organizational framework for leadership, food, and movement. And so we use the chakra system to, first of all, identify, well, we all know that our bodies show us when we're overtaxed, when we're stretched beyond our limits. But what do we do about it? Where do we start? And this is the framework that literally gives us, okay, these are the places in your body that you might be prone or vulnerable to dis-ease of flow or disease, either physical or emotional or behavioral. And here are the practices that bring you back to center. And so it's a guidebook that helps you to come back again and again and again, and invites you into your own unique language, your own body literacy and mind-body connection.
I really appreciate that. Everything that we do is through the lens of helping the individual express themselves, right? Understand the stories, understand the pieces that are there. We used to even teach a whole concept that people had to get to the root of their traumas and triggers before they could actually effectively remove them, right? And so I really appreciate the intentionality, both with the root of Rootzilliance and the story that brought us all together there, but also giving us an understanding on the path for how each individual here can actually navigate through it. You know, I really appreciate the way you talk about stuff. I've done a lot of chakra work myself. I've done a lot of energy work. I've done a lot of consciousness and meditation work. And every morning right now, I've been working with a consciousness and meditation coach for the last, 4 years now, who's just become a dear guide in my world. And we communicate on a daily basis. But every morning, I'm actually getting a aura scan that's giving me basically interpretations of where each one of my chakras is currently sitting, and with the knowledge and understanding on how do I then open myself to download what I need to for the day so I can move based on where my beginning point is, right? And so it's an external validation to an internal piece. And I tell you, we've been doing this daily now for about 10 months with ridiculous high degree of accuracy in what it actually suggests, both on what I'm experiencing from the second I wake up in my downloads to the moment I get the downloaded report. It's phenomenal. And the work that you're doing is really, really critical. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you got to take our leadership map. So we have a free leadership map that you can take online. And so the current framework is geared towards women leaders, because women are so far behind in having a path to leadership that actually honors our health and well-being. But the framework applies to everyone. And you can take your leadership map, meaning it's a 15 to 20 minute survey that identifies 24 of your character strengths, rated 1 to 24. And then we've mapped those. They're the VIA strengths. That is part of another body of work that we've drawn from, but we've mapped those strengths to the chakra system. Oh, and then you can see where you can be strong in a chakra, but that can mean that you might tend to overuse. It's almost like it's like somebody who talks and talks and talks and talks and talks and doesn't know when to stop or interrupts. They're over open throat chakra, as opposed to a closed one where they can't speak up and they stumble over their words and they don't speak their truth. There's this pendulum again. So you can take your leadership map and find out where, what are your greater strengths.
I think that's a great resource. I'm going to definitely have to check that out. You sparked a remembrance of a question I wanted to ask earlier when you just answered that. And so thank you for bringing it full circle. You talked about your mother, and you talked about how your mom really only knew the roles as a wife or a daughter, or right. I'm a father of a daughter. And I care very, very much in her having positive examples of women that she can model after. Her mom is an incredible example for her, and she's an incredibly strong woman that is my partner and has been in life and in business. But when did you start to realize the mingling or lack there of understanding of the roles that women could play? How did you start to evolve that thought process? And how are you helping facilitate and empower women today through all of your work to shorten that curve, to make sure that they also have those opportunities that you said often don't exist in front of them?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. So I feel that I've always, in many ways, identified almost like as a man in my life up until I moved to the Azores, really. And I'll get to the moment that helped me to realize, to answer your specific question. But I say that I've always felt like a man because I've always been the go-getter and the one that pushed the envelope, that put myself out there because it's what worked. It was the survival mechanism that worked. And I spoke about that with here, of course. But when I moved to the Azores, and this island is, it's Atlantis. It is Atlantis calling home again the souls who are powerful and here to make a difference. I'm sure you'll be here one day soon, I have no doubt. And there's something magical that happens here. I was very clear that I was not honoring my femininity, and that came through those chronic health challenges that I mentioned. It was, and we of course, in our resilience framework, we put reproductive challenges in the sacral chakra. It's a sign of an imbalance in the sacral chakra. And if you're way too disciplined, if you're way too go, if there's not enough joy, if you don't give yourself permission to play inner child, letting your inner child take the reins, then there's going to be a block. And it's no wonder that in my life of go, never stopping, that's the issue that came up. And it was when João and I were trying to have kids, quote unquote, we were sort of open to what the possibilities would bring. And we weren't really trying, other than we just weren't using protection when we made love. I got you. And things weren't happening again after, time and time again. And a few years went by. And then I remembered that, gosh, I had not one, but two cervical cuts. The cervix is the neck to the uterus. And it meant that sperm basically had to travel that much further to make it. And it made so much sense to me. So I was, in the meantime, reading books by Anna Dea Judith and by Christiane Northrup on the connections between emotions and physical. And I started paying attention to my cycle. I started mapping out, okay, when am I ovulating? Of course, I wanted to know that. And then, I feel sluggish when I'm menstruating. My brain it's foggy. It doesn't make the same wow decisions that it used to, and in the other times of the month. And I started tracking my cycle, and all that combined helped me to realize that, oh my gosh, us not getting pregnant has been the biggest gift, because then ultimately the question was, do we want to do IVF? And for us, it was a no. We just said, you know what, if it's not happening, if it's not popping out of thin air, it's not happening on its own, it's not going to happen. And he is 50 and I'm 42 now. So it's not happening, and that's fine. That's our decision. And I'm more grateful for the lessons that this whole thing taught me in embracing my femininity and embracing this side of myself. And so how it leads me to work with women, our whole book is geared towards women leaders. And this concept of we don't need to show up the same day, every day, the same way is a game changer. Most women, myself included, it's the hockey stick. It's the hockey stick approach to growth. It's 600%, exponential growth forever. I saw one of my colleagues on LinkedIn post something like that. And I was like, oh my God, I had to stop myself from commenting something annoying because he's a colleague that I respect. But that is not okay. And so teaching women to honor, and everyone, we all have cycles, right? It's just women's are more obvious because we bleed once a month.
That's right.
And even when we don't, even when women move into menopause, there are still cycles, and men have cycles. Humans have cycles. We have seasons. We can't be in summer all the time.
That's right.
We have to have fall. We have to have shedding. We have to release. We have to have winter, we have to have winter in order to have spring and blossom. So teaching people to honor their own cycles for me, has changed my relationship to myself. For example, I don't plan things when I think I'm going to be menstruating or right before. I don't plan. I would never do a podcast on a day that I was menstruating. I'd be like, blah, 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 blah. I wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And so it's just not, it's not normal. We're not machines. It's not normal to think that we could show up the same way every day. We have to honor that.
I really appreciate you honoring that and putting such beautiful words to it. It brought it full circle as well to even what we talked about in the beginning with the light and the dark. It's all about perspective, and perspective points us to what's important. You said a little while ago, and we're going to be wrapping up here in just a second, but you said a little while ago that you think that happiness and kind of the idea of fun is really like our core center, right? Like that's our natural state. So many of us struggle to find that state, right? Even though it exists so naturally within us. So I want you to think of what has given you the most whimsical fun in your life.
Being in nature, just being in nature
Beautiful.
all the time. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Like hands down, being in nature, any kind of nature, just walking and like noticing and paying attention and realizing how much is around us and how much we're connected.
Yeah. We are way more connected than we know, but I often believe that we're disconnecting ourselves because of the way we're protecting ourselves. And we've got to let that go, surrender, so that we can lean into what we all want most, which is to be connected at the deepest level with ourselves, with each other.
Yeah.
And I think with kind of that broader, larger connection that we all share. My friend, do you have any closing thoughts for our audience?
I would just ask people to consider, what is your highest good? What are you being guided to do? If we can get away from, okay, I need to make X amount of money, I need to be in this role, I need to be in this field. Like if you could pull away all of that, what is your highest and best use? What is your highest good?
Beautiful. Rimi, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Ryan. What amazing questions. What an honor to be here and share my story.
Well, thank you. And for those of you that tuned in, Rimi went deep. She told us about all the stuff I led into in the very beginning, and she's clearly had to dig deep. She's talked about the perspective, moving from dark to light, the disconnection, the isolation, the narratives that were formed in those early periods of her life that caused repeat patterns that came back years later into a singular moment with her husband, where she was brought back to that age of 13. How often does that happen to you? How often are you reacting to something right in front of you, and it has nothing to do with what's right in front of you, but everything to do with how your grandma looked at you when you were 4? The reality of it is what is your best guide? What is your best good? What is your best use of time? And the only way that you get there is if you continue to stand in your truth, seek honesty, and calibrate yourself back to center wherever possible. But to do that, it's going to require you to flip open your lid and scan your can.
What you can probably tell by now is that I love telling these stories, but what I love even more is the impact that's coming from them. You see, we're on a mission to impact over 1 billion lives as quickly as possible, but to do that, we need you. See, we believe that moved people move people. And so all I'm asking is, if you've resonated, connected with any of the messaging, please consider commenting, sharing, leave a rating and review. Thank you so much for tuning into Flipping the Lid. And if you want more information on the show, how to become a guest, how to recommend a guest, or any of the other details, head over to flippingthelid.com. We'll see you there.